Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cadmus HR live stream, where once a week we delve into a topic of culture. My name is Daniella Young, and I am an author, TEDx speaker, and Army combat veteran, as well as the culture and leadership person on the Cadmus HR team. So once a week, like I said, take a deep dive into an issue, something that has to do with workplace culture, with leadership, with today branding, for example, and write about it and get into it, and then sit here and chat with all of you about it, because sometimes we all like to watch videos rather than read a bunch of difficult words on a page. So like last week, this one is pre-recorded because, mom life, and my husband's in Afghanistan and I had some things going on. But usually the idea is that this is live, it's streaming on all kinds of different social media platforms, and you can reach out and chat in live time, have discussions. So this week, our issue is called Branding for the Win, the Importance of Messaging in War and Business. And I'm going to be talking about branding and messaging in two very different industries and some insights, and then of course, some tips on how you can best brand yourself in your space. So I was recently listening to the book of retired four-star general, Stanley McChrystal, who you guys have heard me talk about a few times in the past when I read his book on leaders. Now I'm listening because, we all have limited time. So I'm listening to his memoir, which is called My Share of the Task. And Stanley McChrystal, for those of you who don't remember, was the commanding general of all forces in Afghanistan, meaning, he was the top guy in charge of the coalition, which was 66 different countries fighting over there. And he was the general who ended up with somebody on his staff talking to a reporter, and the article was published and it came off as, attacking to the president, which of course no member of the military is allowed to say really anything negative about the commander-in-chief, at least in an official capacity. So Stanley McChrystal ended up resigning from his role, retiring from the military after 30 or 35 years, and moving on to do other things. So interestingly enough, that was, of course, a branding issue for Stan McChrystal. And his memoir was one of his ways of coming back from this and telling the whole story from his perspective, including, the lead up to his career, the lead up to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. He talks about the mission to take out the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which he was responsible for, and a whole bunch of other things. So great book, but we're not really here to talk about the book. We're here to talk about, this very interesting part as I was listening to him explaining Al-Qaeda and how it came to be and how it grew. Even though he's telling a history, he's talking about it in business terms, which was very striking. So when he's talking about how they achieved worldwide notoriety, he starts talking about, again, using these very specific business terms. So when he talks about these different groups that opened up in different countries, he refers to them as franchises. The Al-Qaeda in the country of two holy places, so Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq franchise, the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan franchise, et cetera, et cetera. And so from there, I started really paying attention. And, he starts talking about these other terrorist networks that are their competitors and who they eventually merged with in some cases. When he talks about 9/11, he discusses it as a major branding win for Al-Qaeda. It was the moment when they went from being just another extremist group vying for recognition to becoming the recognized leaders in the fight against the United States for any and all countries that are involved in this ideological or physical fight against the United States. And so then from there, he starts talking about how they sort of realized and figured out that the best way to beat the terrorists was to change their thinking from traditional warfare, which is what had always been done in the past, to branding wars. And this essentially becomes an early precursor to what we later referred during my time at war as the efforts to win the hearts and minds of the local people and support the fight against terror, or to win the local people's support for our side in the fight against terror. And he uses a specific example when Al-Qaeda set off a series of car bombs in Iraq and ended up killing a whole bunch of different people, members of the UN, members of other organizations that were all working together in Iraq to try to stabilize the government this became this sudden branding loss that specifically affected the United States military, because all of a sudden there's all of these armed American soldiers walking around and pretty much no one else. So to the casual observer, to the person that's living in that country, who's scared, whose lives are at risk, whose livelihoods are at risk, all they're seeing is this invading American army, rather than a complicated combinations of country and pretty much, the entire world working together to rebuild the government. So again, interesting book, very interesting way of thinking as a business and the military as a business, and what branding needs to go into that versus sort of just like, we need to win this war, which of course becomes the important part of the strategy for how we would like to win the war. So then, switching to a completely different industry, and it's always funny to me when you start talking about certain issues, you start to see examples of it everywhere. So last week, I got to be a fly on the wall at a meeting of cannabis industry professionals in Washington State. I told you, very different line of business than the military. So, and of course, for those of you not in Seattle, in Washington State, marijuana is legal. So legal, above board industry. And my friend who works in cannabis had been actually explaining to me in the past how one of the major issues facing the cannabis industry today is branding. And that's why he was brought on board. The cannabis industry is working so hard to transform their image from that of like illicit street drug dealers to something more like the vendors of fine wine. They want everyone to realize that they're professionals, they produce a product that's legal and beneficial, and that they have like immense amount of detailed knowledge about this. Like, hearing people talk about the properties of a strain of cannabis is literally no different from hearing a sommelier talk about all of the flavors in the bouquet of the wine that you're tasting. It's quite striking. So, and this meeting specifically was about them getting together and preparing their industry standard response to the perceived vaping crisis, which is, of course, another branding issue. So cannabis essentially shares no similarities or health issues that have recently been associated with some of these other forms of e-vaping. Yet the governor of Washington is about to conduct all of these bans, to issue all of these bans on different forms of vaping products. And so the question they were grappling with in this meeting was, how do we most successfully differentiate ourselves from the e-vaping market and brand our products as these healthy, useful things, so that we can avoid reduced profits, legal problems, and all the other things that are going to come out of these bans. So, again, very interesting, sort of compare and contrast these two very different businesses. And the same question comes out, right? How do we best brand for mission success and profitability? So I went straight to some branding experts, and I got 5 secrets for successfully branding your business to share with you. And the first one is find out how people see you. So important to realize that what you see is not always what you're projecting or what other people are seeing. Sometimes it's lack of translation. Sometimes you see a problem that other people don't see, or you don't see the problem that people do see. And the only way you find this out is by talking to your customers. I'll never forget when I was trying to start my business, I used to talk about teaching military leadership skills to CEOs. And everyone like nods their head, and then nobody buys anything. And finally, there was a CEO that asked me, what do you mean military leadership skills? Don't you all just yell at each other? And all of a sudden it was so clear to me that, of course, even though it's totally not correct, this is the way that military officers have been branded. And so what I was trying to do, which was teach actually some very developed leadership skills and leadership development programs that we've had in the military, but that communication was not coming through because I didn't understand how people saw me. Okay, so step number 2, weave your brand into everything that you do. You can't say one thing and mean another, and especially today when information is everywhere. And I'm sure we can all think of so many examples of this. And interestingly enough, since we are talking about the US military, they even ended up putting women into combat, which was something for 200 and almost 50 years we never even considered. And it was essentially from branding. It was from this same idea that started with, Stanley McChrystal, and even going back before that when people studied insurgencies. And it came down to, in Afghanistan, if we wanted the conservative Muslims in the local population to truly believe that we cared about them, believe those things that we were saying, believe that we were only out here to get the terrorists, then we needed to have women on the teams, because that was an important part of their culture, was women only dealing with women. And so that branding issue wasn't enough for us to say it. It wasn't enough for us to do it sometimes. It had to be in everything. Your consistency matters so much. Number 3, so after you've already figured out the way people see you, woven your brand into everything you do, number 3 is don't try to please everyone. A lot of times, new entrepreneurs especially think that there's a danger in defining their ideal customer, that you're going to put yourself in a corner, that you're going to lose money, when in fact it's the opposite way around. When you message to a niche, you're going to get your message across. And it's not going to work for everyone. And if some people are mad at you, that's okay. That means you're making an impression. So don't try to please everyone. That way you're just sort of casting too wide of a net. You're probably painting way too broad of strokes, and your product or service is not going to appeal to people. Just focus on sending very strong messaging to the ones who are your ideal customer. Number 4, produce value. This is my favorite step. This is the first rule of networking. And it's so important to focus on. Just always, always produce value. It doesn't matter in the end how you price your product or your service, a lot of times what you call it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're targeting the right market and you're able to show value, people are going to buy your product. And you can ask yourself a lot of different questions to help you figure out the value, such as what sets you apart from your competitors, what exact value do you provide, and how can you define that for people? What are the ways that you're going to tap into your customers' emotions to make them feel something, to make them feel value? And then, of course, is it in sync with your brand? And number 5 and final step can be to associate yourself with other strong brands. So, trust plays such a big part into branding. And if there's a strong association between two brands, for better or for worse, we're going to assume that they have equal values, equal appeal, equal benefit for us, which is, of course, why we see many times like big companies like Coca-Cola or something might have a morality clause with a celebrity who represents them, because they know for a fact that, one false move on the side of that celebrity and bad publicity is going to be so much harder to overcome for their brand than all the good publicity in the world that they could pay for. So associating yourself with strong brands, with other people with your same message, with other household names that have products like you, can also be a very smart tip when you're talking about branding. And those are our 5 steps for today. That is our discussion on branding your business and branding for the win. I am Daniella Mestinek-Young. I am a TEDx speaker, author, combat veteran, and co-founder at Cavness HR. Cavness HR is a virtual company that we are building to make big business levels of HR available to small businesses. So often small businesses don't have HR, don't realize they need HR, or don't have qualified HR, and they can be putting themselves at risk. The average small business is at risk of losing $10,000 for every employee per HR incident that they have. And so if your business has 10 to 50 people, you could be at risk of losing a whole lot of money, enough to put you out of business. You shouldn't risk it. You should definitely have HR expertise on hand, however you are able to make that work for your company. Our company does a subscription model where you get online services, you can have virtual consulting, you can do webinars, different programs online, you can get a lot of your handbooks, employee handbooks, onboarding, offboarding processes, all done at a very, very, very small fraction of the price of what big business HR, full-time HR people would cost you, or what expensive on-site consultants would cost you as well. So if that sounds interesting to you, please check us out, www.cavnesshr.com. You can follow us on social media. We're always putting out interesting content about HR, about culture, about leadership. We've got some pretty cool podcasts you can check out. So follow us, stay in touch, and remember to be great every day.